The World War II podcast is funded by listeners like you. To support the show, why not commit to $1, a pound or a few shekels a month? A lot of small contributions goes a long way towards me finding the time to put together and pay for these podcasts. I've set up a Patreon page. You can find the details on the website www.podcast.com. And for those who have already shown their support, thank you very much. It is very much appreciated. Hello and welcome to another World War II podcast. In this episode, we're looking at Nazi war criminals and those who track them down. I'm joined by Andrew Nagorski. Andrew is an award-winning journalist who, for 3 decades, served as a foreign correspondent and editor for Newsweek. He's written a number of books focusing on the Second World War, and his latest is The Nazi Hunters. Though, if you're in the UK, the title is In Pursuit. As the war closed, many low-ranking Nazis escaped capture, scattering across the world, blending in with the millions of displaced people. In the following decades, a small band of individuals would devote themselves to tracking down and highlighting these former Nazis. The search would see Adolf Eichmann being discovered in Argentina and snatched by Mossad, through to the uncovering of former UN Secretary-General Kurt Waldheim's attempt to cover up his wartime history. Andrew, thank you for joining me. When did the Allies start to think about what to do with those they deemed to be war criminals?
The Allies talked about this issue while the war was going on, about what to do with these war criminals on a scale that had never been quite seen before. And it was a very heated debate often, particularly between Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. And it took some odd turns because Stalin's first instinct, and he told this to Churchill and Roosevelt, well, I don't think it was directly to Roosevelt, but to one of his envoys, was, why don't we just do kind of a Soviet-like solution? Let's take the top 50,000 commanders of the Germans had and just go out and shoot them. Churchill was horrified by that, and he expressed that view. And at one point, Roosevelt actually said, well, we could compromise. We could take out 49,900 or so and shoot them. It was a rather lame joke, to put it mildly. But in fact, what Roosevelt was much more interested in was having a trial and getting some of the top people in and put on trial, having their crimes clearly documented, and dealing with the issue that way. Oddly enough, Stalin kind of liked that idea too, because his idea of a trial was a show trial, which they'd had plenty of in the Soviet Union. So you just go out there, you pretend you have a trial, and then you execute these people. And the Brits, Churchill in particular, were really began to think about, well, we don't want to participate in a show trial. That, too, is a fraud. And as we've seen from recently revealed documents, some of the minutes, in fact, the Brits at one point suggested, why not just execute not 50,000, but a group of top Nazis and make an example of them and leave it at that. That went nowhere. Eventually, Roosevelt and Stalin agreed on the Nuremberg trials. Britain went along with it, and with the Americans, of course, insisting that this would be, and the British, that this would be a real trial. And in fact, Nuremberg was not a show trial, even though some Germans initially tried to portray it that way, where real evidence was presented. Right from the beginning, you could see that it was not just about administering justice, but it was also about sending a message to a people that had been indoctrinated that all these crimes were committed in your name, and that you have to understand this exactly what happened. Otherwise, the lessons of this war and the Holocaust will be totally forgotten. So that's why, for instance, they allowed for documentary filmmakers to come in and show some of the footage, for instance, of the liberation of the camps and the awful scenes from that. And then both the the Russians and the Americans worked on documentaries about the trial itself, although that became a separate, very complicated story. So I think the evolution of this is very interesting. At first, there was this whole notion of let's just get revenge, which was an understandable one, and certainly the Red Army got revenge in spades, murdering and raping as they marched not just through Germany, but even starting in Eastern Europe, some of the victims as well. But then the idea was also to channel that anger and control it by actually having a legal process, turn this into a legal process. And that was quite a difficult task to accomplish, but it was accomplished. And I think people began to look at the whole issue of what do you do with the vanquished who had been responsible for so much tragedy in a different light.
Do you think their plans changed? Because presumably they hadn't really, when they started thinking about it, seen the extent of the atrocities that had been committed. I mean, was it a permanently evolving plan?
Yes, it was. There was nothing set in stone here, and it was constantly changing. And of course, there was no way to hold everybody accountable who had committed, mass murder, because so many people had been killed. So many people had died, not just in warfare, but had been deliberately targeted as Jews, as communists, as gypsies, as whatever group it was. And a lot of that only became apparent to the victors as they liberated concentration camps, as they encountered the millions of people who were just displaced persons. So you had an improvised plan. How do you deal with this? And then how do you identify, aside from the very top officials who are known, and if you can catch them, okay, that's fine. But then who do you identify? At what level do you grab, say, a concentration camp guard or commander? Someone, is it for people who can be identified for particular acts of violence, or is it based on the position they are held? All of these things became subjects of debate, not just immediately after the war, for decades to come, because it's an issue of, for instance, one of the lawyers involved in prosecution of some of these cases told me, look, if you talk to people who were, for instance, in the concentration camps, getting them to identify who actually committed the worst atrocities. In some cases, it was clear, but as several of the witnesses, the survivors would say, I never looked at any of the eyes of the people who held my life in the balance. You looked at their boots. You did not. The last thing you wanted to do was make eye contact. So it was an extraordinarily difficult task to have this notion of achieving justice after the war. And of course, there was no perfect justice and there could not be in this case. But the people who defended the process to have trials, of trying to identify who was responsible for at least some of the most grotesque and largest scale murders, it was necessary to prove that, unlike in previous wars, we're not going to just have a period of revenge with no pretense of a judicial system and a judicial process, but we'll try to establish certain principles about how to do this, however imperfect that system is.
So, I mean, there was trials at Dachau and Nuremberg, wasn't there? What was the approach that the prosecution took against those initial people that were chosen to stand trial?
The first Nuremberg trial, of course, was the most famous one, where you had Hermann Goering, Hans Frank. You had a group of top Nazis, and there were 11 of them who were sentenced to death. And Hermann Goering committed suicide before he met the hangman, but the other 10 were hanged. Most of this was based on clear documentary evidence At Nuremberg, most of those trials initially were based on, there was such a massive documentation, and the Nazis did demonstrate that trait of documenting all their horrible deeds. And there was that first trial, and then there were a dozen secondary trials. And one of them, which I described in the Nazi Hunters, was conducted by this man, Benjamin Ferencz, a young army lawyer he was only 27. He had graduated from Harvard Law School, became part of Telford Taylor's prosecution team. It was a case that was not even supposed to ever be tried because they already had lined up. They had different cases for, say, doctors and businessmen and so forth, industrialists. And somebody on the research staff of the prosecution had found in Berlin, almost by accident, a set of documents which had all the orders of what were called the Einsatzgruppen, the special killing squads that were sent out on the Eastern Front in the early days of the war, before the gas chambers were really operative. And initially, the way these units killed Jews was simply to go into villages and towns and line people up, usually in front of pits, and just mow them down, men, women, and children. And the commanders of the units would have these reports saying, we killed 1,100, say, in village X. Next day, we killed 1,300 in village Y. So you had documentation for over 1 million deaths. And the names of the commanders of these Einsatzgruppen who were responsible for that. And so Benjamin Ferencz, this young prosecutor, who is considered a pretty junior person on the staff, goes to Telford Taylor, who was in charge of all the follow-up trials to Nuremberg, and says, we've got to try these guys. And Taylor says, well, we hadn't planned on that. We don't have it in the budget. You know, bureaucratic considerations are, even in these kinds of situations, are always at play. And he says, I don't even have a prosecutor to assign to this case. And so Ferencz, who has unbelievable chutzpah, as they say, says, well, I'll prosecute this case. And so this 27-year-old Harvard Law School graduate is given this case because nobody else is there to take it. And he becomes the prosecutor in what is called the biggest murder trial of all time. And he says, I could have picked, there were 3,000 Einsatzgruppen. All of them were guilty of murder. But I picked the commanders who seemed to be the most knowledgeable, the most well-educated, who could not plead in any way that they did not know what they were doing. And he carried out this case. So this was sort of the top tier murderers, as it were. The Dachau trials were different. The U.S. Army conducted trials in Dachau, which were about not just for the staff of the Dachau concentration camp, but of other concentration camps. And that was more at the level of identifying the people who actually ran these camps, who administered some of this, who were often accused of the worst brutality. So these could be mid-level staffers. They were more based on the eyewitness testimony of survivors, which was a deliberate process to get this testimony on record, to allow the survivors to feel that they have a measure of in the administration of justice. But it became controversial because, of course, eyewitness testimony can always be disputed, and so there were all sorts of theories about which approach was more valid and which not. But a lot of these concentration camp guards and administrators were prosecuted there. Many of them were executed, but then there were appeals and a backlash, and many people who were clearly guilty of horrendous crimes were given clemency very, very quickly.
Then, could they put forward a credible defence, or did they all toe the same defence, following orders?
Of course, the following orders defence was the one they would go to first and say William Denson, the chief prosecutor in the Dachau trials, who again was a very young man in his early 30s, in this case from Alabama, said that is not a defense. And that was another lesson of these trials, is that just following orders is not a defense. There are at certain times when orders are clearly immoral, illegal, and there are all sorts of, even in those times, treaties that you could point to and say that you do not do these things to, say, prisoners of war or to civilians. That is not a defense. The next level of defense usually was, well, I tried my best. I was in an impossible situation, and I tried to help people, or at least make it as painless as possible. They were very contorted attempts at justification, and often just outright denial, and saying, "Oh, I couldn't have done that. I was really a good family man, and I would never treat, for instance, children this way. I would not kill children, and this is all untrue." But in most cases, the evidence was so overwhelming that in those early days, those tribunals convicted a lot of people.
How did the German people at the time view these trials immediately after the war?
In the beginning, there was a lot of opposition, a lot of anger, a lot of denial. I mean, it's typical of people who came in, members of the victorious forces who came into Germany. That I remember talking to one American who was a young GI at the time. He said, "I came to conquer Germany and I couldn't find one Nazi," because everybody would say, "Oh, no, I was against those guys." So there was this denial, but I think that was part of the whole exercise from Nuremberg to the present, has been to break through that and to make people confront their past. That's a very difficult thing to do. I think the trials, however painful, and just seeing the footage of the liberation of the camps and so forth, began to have a first impact. But one of the things I describe in the Nazi Hunters, that it took several more trials and attempts at dealing with this recent history in the late 50s and early 60s, that really created a breakthrough into the psychology of many people and wanted to confront it. And in many ways, the youth revolt of 1968, which happened in many parts of the world, but in Germany was spurred by the effort by many young people demanding to know the answers to the generation of their fathers and mothers. Where were you in all this? And why haven't you come clean about what your role was? To its credit, I think West Germany has done more than any country has in history in trying to face up to what was done in the name of what was then, of course, the German Reich. East Germany never did that. East Germany always, the communist rulers of East Germany always claimed, "Oh, it was those bad Germans in the West," even though
it was used as propaganda.
It was used as propaganda, and West Germany was always portrayed as the country that harbored Nazis, and of course there were many Germans, many Nazis who very easily slipped into new roles in West German society. But it's also quite evident that many German Nazis slipped into roles in the security services in the Stasi in East Germany and other parts of East German society. So nobody came out clean here. But I think the West Germans as a whole tried to deal with this issue much more openly than the East German, and honestly, than the East ever did.
And did they actually successfully trace and prosecute many between, in the last 70 or so years?
At first, the prosecutions were by the Allies, that they had the authority, but then it shifted over very quickly to, say, the German authorities, the Austrian authorities, and there were quite a few prosecutions early on, but then they dropped off very rapidly. And the key determinant here was the fact that the Cold War started. 1948, you have the Berlin airlift, the confrontation between the Soviet Union and the West, the US, the UK, and others really escalates. And quite soon, nobody has much of an interest in bringing up war crimes except for a few of these early Nazi hunters. And a lot of people are very happy to see this issue disappear as sort of a kind of, okay, we had the Nuremberg trials, the Dachau trials, a few others. Let's not dwell on this. There was a denazification process in Germany that attempted to purge some of the top Nazis from new positions in the democratic regime. It was clearly not going to do that comprehensively. And so there was this whole notion that this issue is one that people wanted to put behind them, or certainly governments wanted to put behind them. And for instance, I interviewed a man who was from a German Jewish family. He had gotten out to a British boarding school in the mid-30s as a boy, ended up in the States, became an American citizen, and comes back with the U.S. Army, and heads the first CIA outpost in Berlin. And he told me he was supposed to be looking for high-level Nazis to prosecute, but he was already focused far more on Soviet agents in Berlin. He lost all interest in tracking down Nazis because he said, look, that was the last war. As far as most of us were concerned, we were concerned about the new war, which was the Cold War, and who was going to infiltrate our societies and who was going to undermine our societies. That was happening all over.
Large numbers slipped the net because they didn't know what they were looking for. People were Europe was full of displaced people, and I guess there's an unofficial wanted list amongst the Nazi hunters. And I guess high up on that list, and possibly the most famous with his capture is Adolf Eichmann. What's the story behind his trace and capture? Because it is a story of daring do, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, the Adolf Eichmann case is one of these fascinating cases where there's a lot of mythology about Nazi hunters. There are the movies like Boys from Brazil, The Marathon Man, where you have Simon Wiesenthal-like characters tracking down people into the jungle or whatever in South America. The reality is often more prosaic, as Beate Klarsfeld, one of the Nazi hunters in Europe, said. Often all you had to do was look up someone in the Cologne phone book, because there were people who were sort of hiding in plain sight and thought they were immune. But in the case of some of the really high-profile Nazis like Adolf Eichmann, who had really been responsible for the whole transportation system to get Jews to Auschwitz and other camps, they, of course, knew that they had to flee. They could not hide in plain sight. And there was what was called the rat line to South America, where various sympathizers would help get people like this to places like Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia, where there were sympathetic governments who turned a blind eye to high-level Nazis. But many of them fell into Allied hands right as the war was ending. And Eichmann, for instance, was captured by the Americans. There's no evidence that the American units that happened to capture him, and he, of course, already had an alias. He was pretending to be a lower level officer, that they had any idea who they actually were holding. It's hardly surprising that someone like Eichmann could game the system pretty well and figure out how to provide enough of a cover story. And as you said, with all the displaced person and former German and Austrian soldiers sort of wondering about or in captivity, the young GIs or British soldiers who were holding them often had no idea who these people were. And if they purported they had fake documents, they could easily get away with that. And so Eichmann slipped through that system pretty easily, ends up in Latin America, in Buenos Aires. For a long time, the Israelis themselves were not that interested in hunting Eichmann. Stephen Wiesenthal and another Holocaust survivor, Tuvia Fried, kept saying, we've got to keep pushing the Israelis to get on his track. And Wiesenthal claimed to have his lead as early as 1953 that he was in Buenos Aires, or at least in Argentina. Whether or not that lead was a valuable one or was it too broad, the point is, I then interviewed Rafi Eitan, who was the chief Mossad agent, field agent, who led the whole operation to kidnap Eichmann in 1960. And he told me in the early 50s, we simply did not have the resources to go after Eichmann and to mount that kind of operation. And at one point, Eichmann also told me, in 1953, I first set foot in Germany. I came by train to Frankfurt, and I set foot in Germany. And I thought to myself, if I had been here a few years earlier, if I had set foot in Frankfurt, I'd probably be immediately executed. How things have changed. And at that point in our conversation, I asked Eitan, well, what were you doing in Germany in 1953? As a young Mossad agent. And he said, it's not what you think. I had nothing to do with hunting Nazis. It turned out, as Eitan explained it to me, he was there to meet with the various Mossad agents in Eastern Europe. And their main task at that point was to identify Jewish survivors, for Holocaust survivors who are coming out of Eastern Europe, going to Israel, where Israel was having an influx of these people, which they wanted and needed. But they also knew some of those survivors would have been recruited by the KGB or other Eastern intelligence services. So they needed to identify these people. And the main reason was it was a question of Israel's survival, which was their main priority. And if someone was, for instance, a Russian Jew was in fact a KGB agent, they knew that whatever this person transmitted back to the KGB would very quickly go to the Arab side. This was at the time, during the early days of the Cold War, the Eastern Bloc was, of course, on the side of the Palestinians and the Arab nations who were seeking to strangle the new state of Israel. It's perfectly logical, but it's something, for instance, I had not thought about. I too had sort of assumed that these Mossad agents were out there scouring the every place for Nazis. They had far more of an existential threat to deal with. It wasn't until 1957 that a German Jewish prosecutor by the name of Fritz Bauer gets what seems like a reliable tip from someone in Argentina, a German half-Jewish emigre, that Eichmann is in Buenos Aires. And Bauer is too suspicious of his own government and of Nazi sympathizers who might still be working in the German embassy in Buenos Aires to give them that information, and passes it along to the Israelis. And that's where the Mossad picks up the trail. But it takes them 2 years before they really make progress, for reasons, again, that I go into in detail in the book, because of a lot of leads that throw them off. One of the things is they identified the house where they thought Eichmann may be living. They were thrown off by the fact that it was a very modest house in a pretty rundown neighborhood, and that the European woman who came out in front of the house was very sort of unattractive and plain looking. And Eichmann was known as a real womanizer during the war, and they thought he would have a much more glamorous wife and that he would have a much more glamorous house, because the assumption was all these guys who had escaped with a great amount of stolen money. So it was these sorts of things which made the Israeli agents at first skeptical, and before they figured out that this really was Eichmann, it took them a long time, and they could have easily blown their chance. By that time, Eichmann had been He was working, by the way, in a Mercedes plant in Buenos Aires. He had a false name, but to show you how confident sort of some of these Nazi war criminals were, his son still went by the name of Nicholas Eichmann. And his son happened to start dating a young woman who he had no idea her father was half Jewish and blind, by the way. And this father, when he began reading a couple of mentions in German newspapers that they were hunting for a guy named Eichmann, began to put two and two together. The Israelis at that point had decided that it was time to, if there's a war criminal of this dimension that they can grab, they need to do it. But of course, how do you do it? Nobody's going to extradite Eichmann. And so they decided to mount this very elaborate operation of Mossad agents filtering into the country, observing, and then actually physically seizing him. And the two agents who led that operations, Rafi Eitan, the one I mentioned, and another one, Avraham Shalom, as it turned out, when I was doing the research on this, I discovered they were both alive, still living in Tel Aviv. Shalom has died since. And by that time, in their 80s, they were willing to talk about the details of this operation. And it was fascinating. A lot has been written about it. But there were some things you still discover. For instance, they eventually smuggled Eichmann out on a special El Al flight that had been brought in to carry an Israeli legation for 150th anniversary of Argentina. There were no regular El Al flights at the time. So there was one plane with the foreign minister, Abba Eban. They had their window of opportunity to seize Eichmann and to get him out that way. But they didn't know. It might not work. Maybe something would happen. Maybe that plane wouldn't make it. So Rafi Eitan, the head of the field operation, had also the task of getting a plan B. And so I asked Eitan, what was plan B? He said, well, the only other way we could have gotten him out of Argentina was we had Israeli freighter ships coming to Argentina to pick up kosher beef. There were two of these ships who were going back and forth to Argentina on these Zim Israeli lines. And so I worked with the head of that operation and the person and the captain of the ship to set up a little cabin in one of these ships. And in case we couldn't get him out by air, he would have gone on a 6-week journey by ship with all the kosher beef. You know, you can't make this stuff up.
Cruise.
Yeah, it was not the preferred option, but the fact that it was even option B, it was just fascinating.
So when they get him back and he's interrogated, he goes on trial, how does he come across? How do these people, how does he come across? Is he, I think people would like to see him as a raving psychopathic lunatic, foaming at the mouth. This
gets to the heart of it. I mean, one of the things that I found fascinating and what intrigued me about this whole process was, of course, what drove a relatively small group of people who were Nazi hunters to keep this issue alive when so many people wanted to forget it. But the other thing is, every time you had someone like this who was actually captured and then interrogated and put on trial, what was the psychology of this person? And of course, the tendency to assume somebody who committed monstrous acts must be a monster himself. But in some ways, that's the easiest explanation. I mean, the people who seized him and the people who first witnessed him in the dock in Jerusalem were often struck by how ordinary he looked, how kind of like a very minor bureaucrat who, if you passed him on the street, you wouldn't give this person a second look. And now Eichmann's case became particularly the embodiment of this whole debate. Are these people monsters, or are they sort of these drab functionaries of the totalitarian state? And most famously, Hannah Arendt, the German Jewish-born American philosopher, came and covered this trial for the New Yorker and made the case that this was just a drab functionary who just was a cog in this killing machine, while others said, well, that's giving him far too much credit, that he was at heart a raving anti-Semite who was doing this out of conviction. You get into this whole debate, which is worse, and what does that mean about humanity and the capacity to commit such acts? Hannah Arendt's argument was that if you see people like Eichmann as monsters, it gets other people off the hook who followed him because, oh, we were in thrall of these monsters, whether it was Hitler, it was Eichmann, it was Bormann, or whoever you're talking about. And they were the real criminals, and the rest of us were, sort of propagandized or just following orders. And once you get rid of the monsters, we're all in the clear morally, if not legally and morally. But other people said, well, if you portray this person as sort of a drab functionary, the way Hannah Arendt did, then you are really underplaying his individual guilt. She did not buy the notion that he was not individually guilty. But at first, she started out by being very skeptical about the whole value of the Israeli trial, because this is the only time the Israelis tried someone like this and put him to death. But in the end, she changed her mind, and to this day, you still have these arguments about her theory, the banality of evil, which implies this whole cog in the machine approach about these people.
It's a very good phrase.
Yeah, it's a very powerful phrase. Even the people who were involved in the capture of Eichmann are divided on this. I also interviewed Gabriel Bach, the only surviving member of the Eichmann prosecution team. He's a very distinguished gentleman who later became a Supreme Court judge in Israel. And he really could not stand Arendt's whole thesis and saying, and he personally had met Eichmann when he was captured and so forth. And the whole notion that he was just a functionary, he just found absurd. But someone like Rafi Eitan, the Mossad agent who physically seized and pulled him into the car along with his team, said, my impression about Eichmann was that if he had been told to, instead of killing Jews, kill Frenchmen or Welshmen or whoever it was, he would have done it just the same. So whatever his anti-Semitic views or lack of, or whether or not he was anti-Semitic, more so than any other Nazi. I come down in my book and really saying that there are elements of both theories that make sense, and they are not as contradictory as people think. I think I felt after reading all of this and after talking to people and involved in the case that he was both a careerist who wanted to rise in the system and do everything to please his bosses, and that meant killing Jews, but it could have meant killing other groups, or of course it meant killing Jews, gypsies, and anyone deemed a political opponent. But he was also a fervent anti-Semite. He was someone who fervently believed in the Nazi ideology all along. And there's been a new biography of Eichmann, which in Germany by Bettina Stangneth, which provides a lot of the evidence why the latter thesis is also true. But again, I don't, it got into one of these intellectual debates where people were choosing sides. I think you don't have to come out clearly, I'm on side A or side B. There's a lot more to this.
We've touched upon Simon Wiesenthal, and he is the best known. How much of an important role did he have to play in the post-war Nazi hunting world?
I think Simon Wiesenthal, who, by the way, I knew quite well. I'd covered him, met him since he grew up in what was a largely Polish-speaking environment. We spoke Polish together because my parents came from Poland, so I speak Polish. Even the people who became his fiercest critics later admit that he played a critical role in the 50s and 60s in keeping these issues alive, especially when the Cold War really settled in. He was someone who was liberated from Mauthausen, in the concentration camp in Austria, by the U.S. Army. He quickly volunteered to help the U.S. Army identify war criminals, gathers evidence from other Holocaust survivors, camp survivors. Initially, his instinct was revenge, but very quickly, probably quicker than most, he says it's about justice. It's about showing that there is a price to pay for this, and that you have to demonstrate that this behavior cannot ever be repeated. He was a man with a very big ego who was clearly a self-promoter too. He liked to talk about his role. But even the people who criticized him later and believe that he claimed too much credit for many of the more spectacular cases, particularly the Eichmann case, where he in fact did say, I had a role, but it was a small role, one of many. But others claimed he was, in effect, accepting almost applause for capturing Eichmann single-handedly, which was not the way he ever presented it. But when others presented it that way, he did not object very strenuously. Especially in the 50s and the 60s, he kept the issue alive. He tried to create a documentation center in Linz in Austria to gather testimony for these cases, to help prosecutors who at first were interested in following up on some of these cases. But he quickly became frustrated when everybody was beginning to lose interest. At a certain point, had to close down his documentation center there, and only could keep the issue alive by trying to publicize a few of these cases. And then after the Eichmann case created huge publicity about the whole issue of Nazi war criminals, and his name kept being linked to Eichmann's capture, which was an oversimplification, which I, again, describe in many details in the book, but he did have some role in it. He started a documentation center in Vienna that he kept going to the end of his life. And while his wife really wanted to move to Israel, he eventually decided to stay in Vienna on the principle that you have to hunt sharks where the sharks are swimming. He continued to make some breakthroughs, which were not necessarily always leading to prosecution, but in terms of public awareness.
The Anne Frank arresting officer is a good one.
To me, one of the most important things he ever did was to find the officer who arrested Anne Frank. And the motivation for that was he was in Linz, it was still in the 50s, I think it was around 58, when there was a theatrical performance based on Anne Frank's story and her diary. And there were hecklers there, including a lot of schoolboys who said, "Oh, Anne Frank didn't really exist. She was it's just fictional characters presented by Jews to try to make us all feel guilty." And in a cafe, Wiesenthal actually heard some of these boys talking that way. And he turned to them, he said, "Well, what about the diary?" He said, "Oh, they could be made up. Probably wasn't even an Anne Frank's story." He said, "What would it take to convince you that this is a real story? What if I identified the person who actually arrested her and he admitted to that?" And the boy said, "Oh, yeah, well, maybe. Yeah, I guess so. If someone actually admitted that it happened, then I would have to believe it. If someone who served in the Gestapo or the regular police said that." And Wiesenthal took that to heart. And it took him a couple of years until he finally got a breakthrough. He found a list of agents who had been working in the Netherlands at the time, and they were mostly Austrians. He had heard from someone, there was in testimony from someone who had worked for Anne Frank's father, that the name of the arresting officer was Silber something. And with that much of a lead, found a name that resembled that, and went to the Vienna police force and said, "Is there an officer by this name?" At first, the Vienna police tried to cover it up, and then they found the officer. The officer freely admitted that he arrested Frank and the whole Frank family. And of course, he claimed that he was just doing his duty. And in fact, the Austrian courts did not feel that the fact that he just happened to arrest someone who then became very famous because of her diary did not make him a war criminal. But the publicity around the case, I think, finally put a rest to all these conspiracy theories that this was just a made-up story. And you can argue that probably Anne Frank's diary has done more to educate successive generations, especially young people, about the Holocaust and the horrors of the Holocaust and what it meant in personal terms than any number of far more detailed studies of the big picture. And Simon Wiesenthal's role in identifying the officer, then making sure that a Dutch journalist went and interviewed this officer and got him to freely admit he did this. And his only regret was that this whole uproar about his role had led to the fact that he was suspended from the police force for a while and he didn't get free tram tickets anymore. It all brought home just how horrific this was. So Wiesenthal had a huge role in that. He had a huge role also in finding out about a concentration camp guard, a woman who had actually served a couple of years in prison in Austria in the late 40s, but then had married an American, come to and settled in the United States. And of course, hiding the fact that she had been a concentration camp guard and that she had served any prison time, and eventually led to a long drawn out case, but to her deportation and the beginning of a recognition in the United States about how many people in that surge of displaced persons who were then admitted as refugees, that there were quite a few people who had committed atrocities themselves, and making the U.S. sort of wake up to the fact that they also have some accounting to do. And some of these people had also cooperated with the CIA and other security services. One of the things I'm always fascinated about in writing about the history of the war, the rise of the Nazis earlier, and now in the Nazi hunters about the follow-up, is the role of often just a few individuals who refuse to give up on these issues and how much of a difference that can make. And arguably, I think if it was not for people like Simon Wiesenthal, like Beata Serge Klarsfeld in France, and several others, and of course the Israeli secret agents who nabbed Eichmann, this issue probably would have died out by the mid-50s.
Is there many major Nazis on a wanted list left, unaccounted for?
No. And in fact, there are now, most of the people on these lists, of course, have been relatively junior. And some of the major Nazis who were left on these lists, I have a chapter called Chasing Ghosts, where sometimes, like, for instance, there was Albert Heim was a infamous Nazi with a horrific record in the concentration camps. And there were supposed sightings of him in Latin America and Europe and California. There were people who claimed that they had killed him in secret revenge missions. And there was a long effort to identify him. He was on some of these wanted lists until only a few years ago. But in fact, it turned out, as ZDF, the German television station, and the New York Times discovered, he had disappeared in Egypt, taking an Arabic name, converted to Islam, and died quietly in 1992. And the most famous case was Joseph Mengele, the angel of death, as it were, at Auschwitz. He had escaped to Latin America too. And in the early 80s, there was a flurry of reports that they were still going to find him. I remember as a reporter for Newsweek in Europe, actually trying to follow this story, and people like Wiesenthal and others were convinced he was still alive. It wasn't until his remains were identified in 1985 in Brazil that it was quite clear that he had died in 1979. He had been a fugitive. He was never caught, but he was clearly afraid of being caught, and the Eichmann case scared him. And according to some of the notes and so forth that were left behind, he had visions of kind of Wiesenthal coming through the jungle and grabbing him, which in a way, I guess, it's the only justice in the case. There were many cases where there were hunt for people who were no longer around.
There's still a very small handful of cases sort of ticking over, aren't they? Has what constitutes guilt, has it changed from sort of 1945 to now? Very much so.
The whole notion of what constitutes guilt was always a very difficult question. It's interesting, some of the Nazis in the beginning, someone like William Denson, the prosecutor in the Dachau trials, or Fritz Bauer, the German Jewish prosecutor who played such a key role in in passing on the tip about Eichmann, but also in then holding the Auschwitz trials in Germany in the 60s to really bring home the message about what exactly had happened then. They believed that just the fact that you had served, for instance, in a concentration camp or in a unit that went out and killed Jews, gypsies, or whoever it was enough to constitute guilt. But in Germany, for instance, the standard became quite different very quickly. You had to prove individual acts of murder or torture. And that meant you have documents or witnesses whose testimony could stand up in court and say, okay, here, SS Major so-and-so actually lined up these people and ordered them shot or shot them himself or put this person, tortured this person in this way. That, again, was very difficult to prove, although in the mid-60s, this trial of Auschwitz personnel in Frankfurt did prove that in many cases. But it was a little bit like this banality of evil debate, because in a sense, if you singled out a few people and said, okay, this guy tortured and killed more than sort of the average guard, you sort of were absolving the person who just did his duty and what he saw as his duty and still tortured and killed people. The standard of individual guilt for specific crimes in Germany in particular was the standard for a long time, which is why so few people were prosecuted. So what happened was one of the big cases which started in the United States was a retired auto worker by the name of John Demjanjuk, who was from a Ukrainian family. And he was accused of having served as a concentration camp guard and being notoriously brutal. And he was first misidentified as someone called Ivan the Terrible in Treblinka, while the documents that came out of the Soviet Union indicated he may have served in another camp, Sobibor, which was exclusively an extermination camp. And anyway, the legal confusion of this case meant that many people believed he was being wrongly prosecuted, particularly in the emigre community in the United States. And he was extradited to Israel, tried in Israel, convicted. But then when evidence came out that he was not the guard they thought he was freed and sent back to the United States. But soon the new evidence was assembled by the Justice Department in the United States, which did prove that he was a concentration camp guard in Sobibor, this killing camp. And he was extradited to Germany, and eventually the German court ruled that you did not have to prove his individual crimes, but just his role in that camp, which was not something he was forced to do, was enough to convict him. Nearly at the end of the process, the German court decides this, which means that for the remaining people who are still alive, if you can identify their function in these killing machines, that's enough to convict him. If that had been the standard a few decades earlier, of course, that would have meant that thousands, hundreds of thousands of people could have been convicted. But now at least that applies to the few remaining survivors, and that's why these cases are considered so important, although even some of the Nazi hunters themselves are reluctant to go that route, and there's a division of opinion on this. There are people like Serge Klarsfeld, the French Jewish Nazi hunter, who believes that you do need to convict for specific crimes rather than for your function in society, that's not fair.
I imagine the issue will kind of resolve itself because, within the next few years, there will be no one left to try. I mean, they're really...
Yes, there'll be no one left to prosecute, even, no matter on what grounds. That's true. Which makes, I think, the symbolism of these last cases all that more important.
Do you think we'll ever know why they carried out these acts?
We talked a lot about Eichmann. I think somebody who in some ways represented that banality of evil thesis even more so was Rudolf Hess, the commandant of Auschwitz, not the Rudolf Hess who fled to England, who was the chief lieutenant of Hitler. His description, which he provided to this Polish investigating judge, who's also a fascinating character, who I count as one of the early Nazi hunters. His name was Jan Sen. His testimony about how he ran Auschwitz and how he would describe at one moment herding people into the gas chambers, including children, and start turning his back on mothers pleading to save their children. And then next moment talking about, I regretted the fact that I did not have enough time to devote to my own children at that time because I was so busy. It's staggering testimony. And of course, he believed he was doing just normal work.
What amazes me is he was so cooperative as well. He just, once he was identified, okay, well, here you go. And he lays it all out.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the great skills of people like Jan Sen, the Polish investigating judge, was to just draw these people out, not to immediately start screaming at them, you were a monster or something like that, but quite the contrary, offering them extra cigarettes, here's some writing paper, you may want to write down some thoughts. And even though they were going for a conviction, which would lead to the death of this individual, treating them seriously to gain their testimony as much as possible. Everyone was fascinated. How do minds like this work? Not just how does the system work, but what's the psychology of people like this? There's a morbid fascination about that process. And Rudolf Hess, the Auschwitz commandant, really exemplified that.
It made you wonder if he really knew that he was doing wrong, the way he kind of laid it all out.
Yes, yeah. The other thing about Eichmann, by the way, was, as you said, the cooperative nature. When they captured Eichmann, as the people who captured him told me, he was first terrified that he would be killed. But once he realized that he would not be killed, and he was ordered, first of all, in the car, as they had him down on the floor, as they were smuggling him to his house, he was at first squirming and trying to say something. And one of the Mossad agents said to him in German, "Be quiet, you have to obey these orders or we'll kill you." And he immediately fell into kind of the obedient prisoner mode, and after that was fully cooperative. And this is one of the things Simon Wiesenthal also observed when he first saw some of the people who had terrorized him the most in Mauthausen being led into the U.S. Army intelligence interrogators, that suddenly these people who had been all-powerful were quivering with fear and trying to do anything to appeal to the people who were holding them. So these role reversals and then how they behaved was also fascinating.
The phrase that kept coming back to me was that banality of evil. I mean, it's such a powerful way of looking at the, and then because then it had me looking at photographs of them as well, and again they're just very ordinary. I mean, I don't know why you would think there were anything else but ordinary people. People look like people.
I know, but somehow you think somebody who did this sort of thing, and we all have in our mind, for instance, the clips of Adolf Hitler, sort of ranting and raving, which was at the culmination of his speeches. But most of these people, they would not appear that way to you. And even Hitler in his early days, what people didn't realize was he worked his way up to that crescendo, which was a very conscious crescendo. He could appear quite reasonable at first, and and very soft-spoken at first before he became this hysterical figure. But most of these people who worked for him, for that system, yeah, you saw them and there was nothing to particularly distinguish them. And I was really struck about the Auschwitz trial in Germany, in Frankfurt in the 1960s. There was a little bit of footage I found from German television showing the defendants as they were walking down the street. They were not yet convicted. They looked like just such ordinary folks who just mingled in with the crowds. That in itself is very chilling.
It is very chilling. Thank you, Andrew. I think we'll leave it there. The Nazi Hunters by Andrew Nagorski, published by Simon & Schuster, is available now. I'm embarrassed to say I had not put much thought into the process of tracking down and bringing to trial Nazi war criminals. This book was a real eye-opener and it is very thought-provoking. If you're looking for something to read, I strongly suggest you pick up a copy. I'll put the links on the website, www.podcast.com. And don't forget, I'm also on Facebook. I try to add supporting documents, pictures and news pieces for each episode when it's released. So if you don't already follow me, it's facebook.com/WW2podcast. It's worth following for some of the extras. That's it for this time out. I'm Angus Wallace and thanks for listening.